For my AP World Final, I decided to learn about the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court case. So, I formulated this research question. How was the Brown v. Board decision received by different groups in America? How did these different social, ethnic, or gender groups react to this decision, and how are they impacted by the decision? I would say I chose this research question because it's not something I had known about before. We had learned a little bit about this decision last year in my US history class. However, we really didn't go into the details of it or how it was received by different groups. So I thought it would be pretty interesting to learn about. This was my thesis. Brown v. Board of Education, a landmark Supreme Court case which proved to be a catalyst to the furthering of the American Civil Rights Movement, was met with a variety of reactions from different racial and geographic groups. Due to long-standing inherent racism in the region, white deep Southerners immediately and entirely rejected this decision, condemning the idea of integration to maintain the superiority of whites. African Americans in the North continued to fight for their rights in an otherwise stagnant society, one which was plagued by de facto segregation. As a whole, however, African Americans were elated by the promise of educational equality under this decision and the hope for the complete reversal of racial inequalities under this new precedent. These varying opinions only add to the tumultuous legacy of the Brown v. Board decision, one which made great strides in educational and societal racial equality while still allowing deep divides to persist, divides which still can be seen today. Here are the three main causes that I came up with for this topic. I would say the first main cause was the 14th Amendment, which was one of the Reconstruction Amendments made after the Civil War. The truly important clause of this amendment, however, was the Equal Protection Clause, which stated, "Nor shall any state deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." And this will come into play later on when we talk about the decision and what the Supreme Court decided. The second main cause, I believe, is the Plessy v. Ferguson case, which was decided in 1896 by this Supreme Court right here. It created the doctrine of separate but equal, which basically meant that different cities or towns could have separate facilities for colored people and for white people, and it would be constitutional only if the different facilities were of equal quality. However, in practice, this did not actually work, and oftentimes the colored people's facilities were of much less quality. I would say the third main cause was the NAACP and their hard work to challenge segregation and Jim Crow laws. They filed many lawsuits against various states, such as South Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware, regarding these segregation laws. Now on to the decision. There were actually 5 different cases, but they ended up being combined into the Brown v. Board of Education case. Now, the 5 different cases that were actually combined into this case were the Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka case, the Briggs v. Elliott case, the Davis v. Board of Education of Prince Edward County case, Bowling v. Sharp case, and Gebhardt v. Ethel case. Though each case was unique, all followed the idea of segregation in schools, and that's why they were all grouped together into one larger case. So, the legal issues in this were the idea that separate but equal violated the Equal Protections Clause, which we talked about earlier, in the 14th Amendment. Now, this was a really difficult decision to reach. It took both the 1952-53 and 1953-54 term to reach a decision. Now, the true turning point in the opinion of the court was in the summer of 1953 when Earl Warren, a new justice from California, was installed. He was really able to unite the court, and he even delivered the decision in May of 1954. Earl Warren stated, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." Though this may sound great, the Supreme Court did not give any direction to its ruling, gave no direct steps on how to implement this or how to desegregate their schools. Part of the reason that they did not give specific steps was because the court expected opposition from the South. However, a timeline was needed. States needed to know how they could put this into place. So that's how the Brown 2 case came in. On May 31st, 1955, the court decided that desegregation needs to occur at all deliberate speed, which still sounds a little vague, but gave states a little bit of direction. Now, there were many different reactions from many various groups, so at this point I'm going to go into analyze these various groups' reactions. First, the white deep Southerners. I think that a good quote to summarize generally the whole Deep South's reaction to this case was this quote by Senator Harry Flood Byrd in 1954. He said, "If we can organize the southern states for massive resistance to this order, I think that, in time, the rest of the country will realize that racial integration is not going to be accepted in the South." So as you can see from this quote, in the Deep South, the whites immediately rejected this decision. They wanted to nullify this decision, and in some cases, public school districts were even shut down because so many white parents were moving their children to private schools or creating private schools for only white students so that they could avoid integration. Now, there were also liberals, white liberals in the South. They welcomed this moderate approach to integration. They thought that this was a good way to approach integration without angering the deep Southerners, even though they were angered. They wanted the process of desegregation to be dealt with individually on the basis of the school board and local court judges. Now, the African Americans in the North were re-energized to fight for their rights after this case. The NAACP helped them to fight for even more rights in their states, which were oftentimes victims of de facto segregation. So this case really helped African Americans to see how they could improve their own rights, even in a society that may seem quite stagnant. African Americans as a whole were really inspired by this decision and understood that this was a turning point in history. They thought that this precedent could change the future of civil rights in general and expand civil rights. They believed that Brown could shift American policy as a whole. However, they were met with resistance when trying to integrate, which is something we'll go into in a little bit. Whites in the North accepted the decision. They saw it was a critical turning point. However, racism was not completely eradicated in the North, which led to some resistance. In general, however, white Northerners appreciated this decision and saw it as a step towards unification of the North and South, which was still an issue, especially in terms of racial issues. Now, there are also race-based organizations such as the NAACP and the KKK, which also had massive reactions to this. The NAACP was very proud of this decision because they had been working on furthering civil rights for many years through protests and also legislative work. The KKK were actually the ones to start the violent mob mentality against blacks, which again we'll talk about later. They instilled fear in Deep Southerners, and they made Deep Southerners feel as if the integration of blacks would be destructive to white dominance. Now onto short-term effects. The Brown v. Board decision was not readily accepted. Massive resistance. Now, massive resistance is something we talked about in the last slide with the Southern Manifesto of May 1956. 101 congressmen signed onto this manifesto, detailing that the South would not accept this decision. Now, an example of the KKK's violent ideology, which was spread throughout the South, was the Little Rock Nine, which you can see in these two pictures. In Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 students were selected to integrate into Little Rock Central High School. However, Governor Faubus, trying to protect his re-election, barred these students from entering by using their own Arkansas National Guard. However, Dwight Eisenhower, the president at the time, signed Executive Order 10730, which sent in the 101st Airborne Division to help these students get into school and also prevent Governor Faubus's National Guard from preventing them to go to school. However, even though these students could make it into class, they were oftentimes met with racist taunts, violence in forms of kicking, hitting, and other very terrible things. As you can see in this picture, there is one of the Little Rock Nine students trying to enter her school. However, she was met with other students yelling at her as she was just trying to go to class. Now onto the long-term effects. The racial achievement gap in schools is still prevalent. Fortunately, it's lowering. For example, Detroit is actually the second most segregated school district with one of the largest achievement gaps in the entire country. A staggering statistic to show this is 40% of all 4th graders are reading at grade level, but only 12% of African American 4th graders are reading at grade level. However, minority races are improving their general NAEP scores at a higher rate than any other racial group. Now, the NAEP is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's a test taken every few years for students. As you can see in the bottom two graphs for mathematics, Asians and whites have the highest percentage of people who pass for their age group, and Hispanic and black students are in the lowest percentile. And for reading, it's the same trend. White and Asian Pacific Islanders have the highest percentage of those passing, yet Hispanic and blacks have the lowest percentage of those passing. This was from a 2013 report. So, school segregation also continues, and it has even worsened from 60 years ago. Around 40% of Black and Latino students in the US are in schools that are over 90% Black and Latino. The average Black student goes to a school where 59% of their classmates live in poverty, and the average Latino student goes to a school where 57% of their classmates live in poverty. However, the average white student goes to a school that is 77% white. Now you can look on the chart of the 20 most segregated states for Black students in 2011-2012. Wisconsin is actually one of the worst for segregation in states, which is very shocking. So, the historical significance of this topic. Though school segregation and racism in the public school system seems to be on the rise, the legacy of the case of Brown v. Board of Education is still a landmark moment in United States racial history. Brown v. Board marked a change in the United States Supreme Court from a state of inherent racism to one where the idea of equal protection for all citizens, regardless of race, was upheld. This turning point in history proved to be a catalyst for the furthering of the civil rights movement in America, which is another critical point of significance for the Supreme Court case.